Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to the second Windrush Day Memorial Lecture. It is my pleasure to welcome Rose Sinclair, a design lecturer in textiles in the design department at Goldsmiths, University of London. I will tell you a bit more about Rose, but first I just wanted to hand over to you, Rose, to say good afternoon and to greet everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you. My name is Diane Regisford and I am moderating this session today, so welcome to you all. This event is brought to you by the Oxford Windrush Group, and it's part of a series of events that have been happening since the weekend to commemorate the Windrush Day events. Windrush and the first arrivals from the Caribbean happened 73 years ago in 1948. We're here today to celebrate, to commemorate, and to educate about the contribution that many of Caribbean origins, we heard that there were people from families from Jamaica, from Trinidad and Tobago. And since then, many, many more have come to inhabit the island of the UK. Great Britain was recovering at that time from World War II, and there was a call sent out for help to rebuild Britain. The annual memorial lecture has been put on by the Windrush Group in Oxford to do those three things that I just mentioned: commemorate, to celebrate, and to educate, and to mark this day, to mark the contribution not only of those pioneers that came on the Windrush, not as migrants, but they came answering the call to come and build Britain. Our contributions have continued throughout the generations. A few years ago, we heard about the Windrush Scandal, where those who came, not as migrants, it's important to note, but to answer the call to support and help rebuild Britain, were then found without documentation. Some were even deported, and we know a lot about what has happened then. We also want to spend a moment to just remember those who had to go through such atrocities after they came to this country. Our lecture today is themed around belonging. So as we all settle in, I would like to ask everyone to, in the chat, any comments, but right now, I'd invite you all to share in one word how belonging feels for you, just to start us off. Thank you. We like doing things interactively, so welcome. I will start. Any others? How does belonging feel to you? The smell of warm, fresh bread. I love that. Being with the people I love. To know where I can lay my head. Warm, safe home. Family. Involved. Home and safety. Thank you so much. Thank you. Before I introduce Rose Sinclair, I would just like to share a little bit about our program today. In terms of the technicals, we're all getting used to Zoom by now. We will have question and answers after Rose Sinclair has delivered the lecture. You will see at the bottom of your screen, if you just hover your mouse over there, you will see that there is a chat box, and we invite you to make any comments. Anytime you're feeling something deeply resonates with you, please place them in the chat box. Sister Amantha, you've raised your hand. Apparently we can't hear you because we're in webinar mode. If you could please, if you have a question, you could just type it to me directly and I can have a look. Thank you. In the Q&A box here, Any questions that you have that arise, please place them in there. And we have Beth, who is with us, who will collate all of the questions. And when we get to the Q&A at the end, we'll go through the questions. We're going to be here till 8 o'clock, so we've got lots and lots of time to engage and to share. Okay, thank you so much. Now, I'd like to read you a little bit in terms of the bio about Rose. Rose Sinclair is a design lecturer in textiles in the design department at Goldsmith at the University of London. This is where she's involved in teaching textiles and fashion and design-related practice up to postgraduate level. Rose has authored several textile books, her most recent being Textiles and Fashion, Materials, Design and Technology, and this is published by Woodhead Publishers, and this was published in 2015. Her current PhD research explores the relationship between textiles, practice, and communities and networks. Networks such as those found in the Dorcas societies and the Dorcas clubs, especially those inherent in the Caribbean communities. These clubs were recently featured on the BBC4 television program Craftivism, Making a Difference, which was aired in February 2021. Her recent paper in Craft Research Journal, entitled Dorcas Legacies, Dorcas Futures, Textile Legacies and the Formation of Identities in Habitus Spaces, discusses the impact of diaspora and migration within this textile network. Recent presentations, installations, and community work using textiles as a practice to initiate discussions around migration, crafting practice, and heritage have taken place at the V&A in an exhibition called Welcome to the Culture Club, Dorcas Stories in the Front Room. This was in January 2016. Mapping Textiles, Dorcas Stories in the Front Room at the Bruce Castle Museum in 2016. Caribbean Front Room, pop-up shop installation in Lewisham Shopping Centre, and this is also in 2016. There was a family day called Windrush Songs in a Strange Land in the British Library. There's the V&A Digital Design Weekend, Windrush Arrivals, and this was in September 2019. In January 2020 at Goldsmiths University, the installation Windrush Arrivals 1948 and the Caribbean Front Room at the Broadway Theatre in Catford in Oxford 2020 to January 2021, most recently. Rose's textile design work has developed in areas of civics, social and public engagement, for which she has been awarded the Warden's Special Award for Community Engagement for 2 years running, that's 2019 and 2020. Rose is a member of the advisory board for the Journal of Cloth and Culture and is co-editor for the Journal of Textile Research and Practice. Wow, amazing. It is our pleasure and our privilege to welcome you, Sister Rose, to this podium on Zoom at least for the second annual Windrush Day Memorial Lecture. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diane, for that. And just amazing to be here today. And I know I can't, normally I would be there in front of you and I probably would have brought a mini front room with me and some bits of textiles to make and be interactive with you. So I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, but I hope in my talk today we can have a really meaningful discussion. And I'm going to take you on a journey of stories. But I hope that today will also be a point of reflection for us all, reflecting on those Windrush elders that may have passed this year due to the COVID, but also just to remember those that were our forerunners, those that set the pathway, those that created the opportunities for us to be here today, those that opened the doors, those that broke down the barriers, those that made it possible for us to have the pathways that we have now, but to know that the work's not finished yet. The work is still ongoing, that we still have doors to open, we still have pathways to make, and we still have stories to keep being told, and they will never stop being told. And the fact that we're now on our 4th Windrush Day means that we can still keep telling the stories. And let's get started on the stories. So I'm going to share my screen. So I can't see anything now when I start sharing the screen. So please put your comments as we go along in the chat, because I'd love to hear your stories as well. And any questions you have, would love to hear what they are at the end. So thank you for coming tonight, and hopefully we can share some more at the end. So I'm going to share my screen now. So I've called this belonging, and also I'm going to go into Siwia. So for those that need translation, it's see, we, hear. Yeah, Siwia. And I want to start off our story by, when we want to talk about belonging, what is it that we are passionate about when we want to belong somewhere? And I want to take an opportunity to ask ourselves, what are we deeply passionate about? And for me, when anybody asks me, what am I passionate about? And I've got to say textiles. As long as I can remember, watching my mum sew, watching the women around me make in the Dorcas clubs, I want to say I'm connected passionately to Black women and their sense of making, their sense of creativity, their commitment to the creative work that inspires and sustains. And at this moment, I want to reclaim those histories. I want to call their names. I want to state their particulars. And I want us to gather, remember, and share our inheritance, whatever that inheritance is, whether it's good at cooking, whether it's good at sewing, whether it's good at reading, whether it's whatever that inheritance is. I want us to take the opportunity to find out how we belong and what we belong, and what is it that we're reclaiming, what is it that we're sharing, what is it that we're stating. And one of the things that I found out from doing my research was that as a design tutor, I was always getting up in front of students and talking about design. But I found every time I stood up in front of them, I could not see myself represented in any design book. And it was the present that my grandmother gave me, which I'll talk about later on in this presentation, that was always in front of me in my study, that made me challenge that perception of not seeing myself. And it was my first visit to Jamaica in 1990. I got off the plane and I said to my husband, everybody's Black. Because I'd never seen that in my whole life, because I was born in England. Yet I'd had the story of my mum and my uncles and my aunties telling me about this is what Jamaica was like. So this notion of how I started to connect with my past and with my present came through this notion of the creativity of the textiles that I was so in love with, going to find out what that was. So I want us to, if we want to find out how we belong, we need to find those things that we belong with. And one of the places where I always found refuge was in a museum. But museums are one of the least places where we can find ourselves and find that belonging. And it's those places that we can sometimes go and disrupt that notion of how we belong and where we belong. And for a lot of us, our textiles are not necessarily found in those places in the way that we would want to see them. And I would challenge you to look at the textiles again that you have in your home and ask yourself, what value does this have? It might not have a monetary value, but it has a value by the fact that somebody chose that cloth, somebody took the time to stitch it or to crochet it or to knit it, somebody had learned a skill to make that object. So that object has a story, that object has a life. And somebody somewhere in your family knows the life of that object, whether it's auntie so-and-so or granny so-and-so or mother so-and-so. And the one thing that we all travel with when we move is a piece of cloth, whether it's the clothes on your back, whether it's that hanky in your pocket. And those are the things that tell us where we belong. Because if nothing else, it's the one thing that you can pick up and go, Mommy gave me this, or Dad gave me this, or Auntie gave me this. And it's the one thing that connects us past with present. And it's the one thing that can tell us where we belong. And if we want to find out about our kind of stories and histories, there are now a plethora of books that now allow us to locate those stories, locate ourselves, to try and look at how we got here, look at the past, look at how we became engaged or understand why we traveled thousands of miles to get here. And there's two stories. There's the story of slavery, where one group of people colonized another group of people and transported them. And then there's the other story where we came through that notion of slavery. We then became a people. And then we said, okay, we want to travel again, or we were invited to travel again. And through that invitation, we came to what we now reside in the motherland. But when we came here, a different story then emerged. And sometimes those stories, they tell us two different scenarios. One where we look really prim and proper. If you look at those pictures of us looking at, oh gosh, styled, the look, however you want to think about how we came, how we looked in our Sunday bests, dressed to the nines. And then there's the story behind the scenes, the story under the book cover. So the story, when you take when you get that really nice book in your hands and it's all prim and proper and it's got the dust cover, and you take the dust cover off. For some of us, the dust cover came off and what was underneath the dust cover wasn't pretty. And we wondered, why did we ever come here when it was cold, dark, dank? What life were we going to actually now have from the life that we left behind? And sometimes that sense of belonging gets shifted. We left behind that family circle. We left behind those things that kept us grounded. And we moved to a space where for some of us, we weren't welcomed. We weren't made to feel welcome. We left behind those structures that made us feel welcome. We left behind our churches, our music spaces, our community groups, our networks. And we came to spaces where we had to form new networks, new spaces, create new places. And for instance, books like Motherland by Elise Dodgson, written in the 1970s, was one of the first books that talked to young girls in schools in 1970s London and connected them with their mothers that had come in the 1950s to try and find out what it was like when they came to England, and created this new play. Andrea Levy's Small Island connects us with Hortense, one of the protagonists, what it was like for her coming to England. She was seen as Miss Speaky Spokey with the white gloves, connecting with Queenie, whose first encounter with a black man was at the 1924 Wembley exhibition. So we know that Black people were here before 1948. We know they were here hundreds of years before 1948. So we knew that there was a sense of belonging for some Black people before Windrush. We see Sam Salvan's Lonely Londoners telling us what it was like for many of the Londoners right at the beginning of 1948. And then we come full circle and we see Michael Macmillan's Front Room exhibition in 2006, taking us back on a journey to 1973, taking us back to the time when we had become much more prosperous. We were able to decorate our spaces. We had moved out of those one rooms where we were cramped in the kind of 1950s, 1960s, one room with a paraffin heater to keep us company. We'd moved out of the one room with the whole families. We'd moved out of the houses where we were sharing 6, 7 families to a house. And we were now in our own homes. We decorated them with our bright colours, with the things that where we'd gone on our Sunday school trips or our one-day trips to the seaside. And now here we were getting prosperous. We could have our radiograms and our TVs. We were getting to the point where we could start to send those photographs back home showing how we'd looked, how we'd prospered. So when we start to talk about sense of belonging, we're moving on. We're telling our stories. But also, we've started to move full circle. And here, I did a workshop in 2019, but the story here is quite different. This is about healthy eating. And by this time, I'm talking with elders who are suffering from diabetes. I'm talking to elders who are finding it hard to, suffering from glaucoma. They're finding it hard to give up those foods that they love because they can't equate the healthy portions to the eating plate that they're given. I would ask you then, do you know what 25 grams of plantain looks like? Have you ever had, do you know that 25 grams of plantain is actually a healthy portion? Put it in the chat if you know what 25 grams of a portion of plantain is. I know what 25 grams looks like because I weighed it out. And every time I've shown it to somebody, they laugh because nobody eats 25 grams of portion of plantain when they have a portion. So if you put it in the chat, and I will tell you, I won't leave it till the end because that's like cruel. But 25 grams of portion of plantain is 2 slices. So if you only ever have 2 slices of plantain to eat, you're eating a healthy portion. If you have more than 2 slices, then you need to recheck your portions. But what this was about was about how can we as a Caribbean community think about our sense of belonging within a place where we don't even see our food represented on the healthy food plate. And so what we did as a designer, my thing is all about how do we create solutions. So one of the things we did, we played around with the UK healthy eating plate, and then we found that it was a Jamaican healthy eating plate, and we merged the two together. So we did a mashup. So we just kind of swapped the foods around and started to explore with a community through a community library project how you could create a healthy eating plate. And we made up some foods and we brought in a load of recipe books and we explored what it was to do healthy eating and healthy portions using the foods that you love. And this is what creates a sense of belonging, doing the things that you still love to do, eating the foods that you still love to eat, but also being that person that you still love to be. And also it became an intergenerational space. And it wasn't about, I can't eat this anymore, I can't do this anymore, I can't be with my family anymore. This was about how do we tell these stories of old and how do we bring the stories of new? So how do we bring the past and the present together? And that's what a sense of belonging starts to develop, this notion of bringing the two together. Like I said before, one of the places that I always love to go to, and this is our museums. And I've loved this ever since I was a student at school. It's just been one of those things that I just find something calming about being in a museum space and just seeing the world, the geography of the world. but also knowing that people collected things because they didn't collect them out of a sense of that I like that. They collected them because they just wanted to. So things end up in a museum because people just like them. But one of the things that I love to do is find out where we exist in these spaces and open our eyes to why that this is important to know that we do exist. We might not see a Caribbean gallery, but there are snippets of us and our existence are there. That tells me that we have value. So if you still have your grandma's 1947 garment or 1950s dress in her trunk, don't throw it away. That's a piece of fashion history. It tells us that somebody lived, it tells us that somebody existed, but it also tells us a piece of history. It tells us something that isn't in the fashion books. It tells us something about who the maker was, who this person's lived story, this person's lived life. This one is Beryl Gilroy, who was one of the first Black head teachers in London. And her son, Paul Gilroy, went on to write There Ain't No, is gone on to be a great writer. And her daughter went on to be a fashion designer herself. This was created by a fashion designer called Nat Gaines in Guyana. So by just looking at Beryl Gilroy's outfit, it tells us that in Guyana in the 1950s, this was the level of tailoring and craftsmanship that was happening on an island in the Caribbean in the 1950s. So it tells us the craftsmanship of our makers at that time, but it also tells us the level of styling. So when we look back in those wardrobes and on those pictures, it's telling us another history, another story. And when we throw them away, what we're doing is we're throwing away our own stories and our own heritage because we don't think they have any value. They do have value. They have value in telling a story that we don't, once we put it into the history books, it revises the history. It puts history in its place and it contextualizes it. It fills the gap. I don't know how many of you have ever, when you're in London and you get on the tube and you hear that note, mind the gap. Our oral histories fill the gap, but our pictures and our textiles and our objects not only mind the gap, they fill the gap, they rewrite the gap. And that's why it's important for us to keep pictures of those things, because they fill the gap, they mind the gap, and they replace the gap. So when we have these reprints of books, we're not only reprinting the books, we're revising the books, we're updating the books, and we're filling the gaps. In Bell Hooks, and I mentioned her right at the beginning of this talk, she talks about in her book, Belong in a Culture of Place, this notion about how place is important. And she talks about that we are born and we have a point in our place where we can chart our lives by everything that we remember, from the mundane to the majestic. But we also know that we have, through that knowing, that art and the act of remembrance, and that our memories offer us a world. We can be sustained by those memories and we can pay tribute to them. But when we bring those memories to the fore, when we bring them, they allow us a revision and renewal. And it allows us to live fully and well. And through that living fully and well, we can now create a place where everybody can belong. And I think one of the things that's become really kind of highlighted through things like the Windrush Scandal, etc., has been that notion that we don't belong. People keep telling us we don't belong here. And I counteract that saying, what do you mean I don't belong here? If I go back to Jamaica, I'm called English. I don't belong there. If you're telling me I don't belong here, but I'm born here, So where do I belong? I don't sit in any liminal space. I don't sit in the middle of space. But I think we have to say to ourselves, we are here, we reside here, and we are here. And through being here, we have made our place. We continue to make our place, and we continue to establish ourselves. And through that establishing of ourselves, we are creating places where we belong. And I think the more we see our histories, the more we are able to establish ourselves. And I will come back again to our textiles, or to the things that make us belong, are the things that act as our cultural markers. And when we remove our cultural markers from our spaces, we remove ourselves, and so we remove our acts of belonging. And how many of you have crochets that either those crochet things that sit, any types of crochet that sit in your houses? For some of us, we've removed them because they're too kitsch. They just don't fit with our beige houses anymore. For some of us, we've put them in the trunks, or put them in the suitcases, or put them in the wardrobes, or put them in the drawers. If you've still got them, just wrap them up in some tissue paper and keep them safe. If you don't want them, send them to me. I'll keep them. I'm photographing all the ones that I've got, and I'm making a catalogue. I'm articulating our aesthetics. I'm making an archive. Because they are our cultural markers. They tell us that we were here. They tell us that we are creative. They tell us that we have an aesthetic, and that aesthetic contributes to a British aesthetic. And until we put those aesthetics in a design book, or put them in some kind of representation, or start writing about them in some kind of journal, or some kind of design discourse, or articulating them, it means that they become absent markers. What I'm saying to you, as soon as we start documenting them, they become cultural markers. They become a means of expression. For us as Black women, they were not only just a means of expression, they're a means of our busyness. And actually, they're a means of our identity, and our identity, not just in the home, but as one of outside the home. And they were also a means of self-expression. So these, and I love the little one with the cup, because for me, the maker of this one just went above and beyond to be able to just crochet. Not only is it this one went over a jug, so this maker decided she was going to make a crochet mat that went over a jug. So when it's a utilitarian piece. So you make your ginger ale, or your lemonade, or your carrot juice, or whatever. You put it outside on a summer's day. You don't want the flies to get into it, but you also don't want it to fly off. So it's weighted with beads. And then you go one step further, you actually crochet a little jug on top of it. That takes some skill. That is some serious skill. And it's 3D, and it is so beautifully made. It's amazing. And then this other one, the one next to it, you can see is again another weighted piece. Amazing piece of creativity. And lots of these were sold at Dorcas clubs, because people just wanted them, because not only are they beautiful pieces, but they are pieces that serve a utilitarian need as well. And they're also very creative pieces. And if I was to put these on Etsy or eBay, people would be snapping them up, because they're not only vintage, they're also utilitarian, and they would be wanting them. And they said, oh, they're one-offs, because they're never made the same again. And they are a form of our identity. They're a form of our creativity. And they're a form of our they're an expression of us and our busyness and our creativity. And it's about what we do with these pieces and how they tell us what we are. And I don't know how many of you recognize this or have seen this type of crochet. This one was made in mid 1970s. And the reason why I remember this is because I don't know if you want to call them misfortunate, but the child that had to go with the mother to the Bullring Shopping Centre in Birmingham to buy the nylon, and then had to sit down as my Saturday job and cut up strips of nylon that then had to be crocheted. And I had to learn the crochet stitch to crochet lots of squares of this, because Mom had big orders to fill for the Dorcas Club Sunday selling thing on a Sunday. And this went like hotcakes, because it meant that women no longer would have to starch the fine crochet. This was Bry nylon. So those of you that know Bry nylon, you put it in the wash. On Saturday morning, you put it in the wash, you stick it on the line and it dries. And then you can put it back on Saturday afternoon, ready, and your front room's all nice and ready. You don't have to spend all day getting the starch out, putting it on the fine crochet. And I thought this only existed in Birmingham until I went to a museum in Croydon and saw the same similar work in Croydon. So I knew straight away as an academic and as a researcher that this migrated through the Black community from Birmingham down to London. So as the researcher, I know that our aesthetics move. And I know then that we have an aesthetic sensibility within our community, and things migrate and things happen and things change. And we have a busyness about our community that allows people to actually do creative tasks. We have a creative will. We have an aesthetic that migrates, that moves, that changes, that challenges. And that sense of belonging, when I saw that work in Croydon, I knew then that there was a sense of belonging within the community that happens. I don't know how it happens, and I'm still trying to work out how it happens, but it happens. I'm just gonna, I hope this video works. This is about how I talk about belonging in a way, but also how I navigated thinking about the working in taking my front room into a shopping centre and using the shopping centre to connect with people. At a time when the very front room, I think, to remind people of what a front room was. I mean, if you look around Lewisham now, we've got tall tower blocks and lots of the houses that used to have front rooms are now split into flats. And I think it kind of can remind people of what spaces used to be like. And I think that's what I want to get out of the installation, this notion of the memory. It's bringing those stories back, but also to say there is value in the textiles, because there's very little written about the domestic textiles of Caribbean women when they came here. In terms of making, they could never find a space because it was, no, you can't come in because of your colour. So their front rooms became those spaces where they started to make. But they would come together and they'd bring their sewing machines and they'd make in their space. I teach on the MA fashion course and I use the installation as part of that process. So I set up the installation and I get the students to think about how an installation can be part of thinking about their own culture, their own heritage, their own stories, and how you can use a story with an audience to engage them. So one of the things that I do a lot of is I do a lot of installations. This one was in Catford in 2020, and this was set up again in a theatre. And again, I use the textiles I've collected over the last, 30 years, but used really intently in the last 10 years. And this is just to help engage with a new kind of dialogue about what it is to make. So what it is to crochet, what it is to make the cushions in the front room, what is it to make the cassava, what is it to make the starch. So for instance, I I spoke to a lot of the elder women, and I learned how to actually make the starch from scratch from cassava. Then they told me that you could make the starch from boiling rice, from boiling potatoes, from using corn flour, so I think I gathered about 20 different recipes for making starch. And then it was all the other stories that you could gather. It was all the other notions of how women network together, the notions of creating safe space, to create spaces of belonging, the notions that in some spaces they were not welcome, and how they made their own spaces welcome. So this notion of how they moved, how spaces became those spaces of welcoming, and then how could I use a 5-day or a 7-day workshop in a shopping centre to create those new spaces of welcome as well. And my challenge every time I do a workshop is, how do I replicate a Dorcas workshop? How do I replicate that spirit of welcoming? And it boiled down to that I was recreating a front room, but with a textile spin on it. So every time I make a space, it is not a grey space. It is a front room space with decorated wallpaper, with all the gadgets, all the paraphernalia of a front room. And then I have those discussions about what it is meant to be about belonging, or what it is to crochet, or what is it to make, or what is it to sew, or what is it to have those discussions about the Windrush generation, or the marginalisation, or migration. And that is where people come in and belong. On several occasions, I even make rum cake, or I make gazadas, or I make coconut drops, or I make peanut drops. So I've gone back and traced even traditional recipes and found out why we make those recipes. So I bring in these other notions of not only the textiles, but the ways that we used to actually greet people with food. So this notion that food is also part of our sense of belonging, and how and why we use those things to make those senses of belonging. Because I found that in a lot of my spaces, I'm not allowed to cook. So I thought, when I'm not allowed to cook, I can't create a space where I can't have food. So I've had to learn to cook and create outside of those spaces. And so I go back to traditional fruit cake recipes, or recipes that I know that I don't have to make anything, it's just there and ready. But like I said at the beginning, we were invited here. So this is 10 years after Windrush, and we're still seeing these invitations, these you can get a flight, you can take a boat. And then and this was in the Sunday Gleaner in Jamaica, telling you how to be a West Indian in Britain. So you were getting newspaper articles telling you how to be when you got to Britain, but also these wonderful adverts saying, well, it'll only take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. For some of you that are in the audience, you might remember what those boat trips were like, how long it would take you, where you were going to end up, how long it took you to actually save your money to get to England, or who was going to actually trust you with that, or who sponsored you, or who partnered you. But also, did any of you read what it was going to be like when you got here, or did you believe it? So how did your sense of belonging, was what in the papers was what you trusted, or did you just think they're just making it up? And if we take a chance to reflect on those arrivals, one of the things that we've done at Goldsmiths is we've recreated the 1026 landing cards, 27 landing cards, sorry. And I'm a textile person, so I'm going to look at all the creatives. So I've actually looked at all the landing cards, and actually found that there were 225 creatives on board the Windrush, ranging from tailors to dressmakers to artists to designers to shoemakers. So I'm still trying to find out where they all came from and what they all did. But one of the most famous ones is Evelyn Wauchope, who was a stowaway. And there are no, unlike the men on the Windrush, there are no pictures of Evelyn, or Avril as she was called, or Averilli. So but we do know that she arrived, she was single, she arrived when she was 39. She later married a Mr. Grafton Holdit, and they moved to the US where she became a landlady. But the fact that she was a dressmaker always kind of just got me as well. But this is kind of the information that would have been on the landing cards. And we took this from the Empire Windrush passenger list. And you can actually go online on the Goldsmiths website. And I think I can put the link back into the chat. And you can actually search the passenger list and see where all the passengers went to. So you can see where they landed at Tilbury, and you can see where they all went. And the youngest passenger was 3 months. The oldest passenger was 91. So you can see the age range of the passengers as well. And it starts to unpick how many were single, how many were married, whether they came on their own. And then you can start to find out those other stories of them. And some of them, the histories and the stories of them get changed because their names in the papers aren't necessarily the names that are on their passenger lists. So our stories can get disrupted. And so that sense of belonging gets disjointed as we go through history, because the stories in the names in the newspapers get changed. Because, you know, we have pet names. So the pet names become the names that are used in the papers rather than the names that are used as your real name, if you like. So in our sense of belonging, our sense of belonging can get disrupted when we don't even use our real names when we are discussed. But when we talk about, say, Evelyn Wauchope, one of the founders, Sam King of the Windrush Foundation, he refers to her as Eva Buckley. In the London Evening Standard, they talk about her as that the 5 Jamaican boxers organised a whip round for her, and they called her Avril, and said that she had £4 in the pocket. She was heading for France. And then she's quoted in the Evening Standard as being Avril, and she said, there was no prospects for me in Jamaica. I couldn't get a normal passage, so I slipped aboard. I'm not telling you how I hid, but the troops fed me with food they brought from the canteen. So this notion of belonging also can come from how people treat you and how they look after you. So I've put the database on there. So if you want to have a look at the database, please do, because it makes really interesting reading, and it unpicks our stories, because we keep getting told there were only 500 passengers. There weren't just 500 passengers. There were 1,027 passengers, and we need to understand the full story of the Windrush to understand the mix of the passengers, who were the passengers, and what were they, where did they come from, and how their histories became entwined in what we call the Windrush generation. But this was one of the stories that also got me thinking about how dressmakers are also integral to our stories of belonging, because it's the making of textiles that make, if the one thing that we travel with, like I said at the beginning, is the cloth that we have on our backs, and it's the one thing that keeps us together. Sport, well, I know we've got a mixed audience, so I can't keep talking about textiles without talking about sports. And cricket is got to be one of those things. And this just reminds me of my dad and his mate. So whilst the women were in the front room doing their Dorcas clubs and their textiles, the men would either be in the back doing the dominoes or listening to cricket. And I remember that. And you'd hear the music, the music playing or whatever, but also the cricket. And the reason why I bring up the cricket is because it was one of those things that connected people together. You'd hear the radio going if the cricket match was on, and you'd hear and it's one of the things that started to create communal groups as well. not only for the men, but also to connect communities together, young and old, intergenerational, to create that sense of belonging. This sport was one of those things that helped people to create those groups, to create this sense of belonging. But one of the things that I also found that it highlighted was also this connection about, we talk about sustainable practices within our communities, how we make things eke out. I don't know about how many of you in the audience, but I don't know how I know we weren't rich when I was little, and I don't know how my mum managed to make stuff. There seems to be like on Saturday, there seems to be like soup that just went on for the whole day, or on Sunday. How did the rice and peas last that long till Monday evening? Or how did the food just seemed, the hard food on a weekday, there just seemed to be loads of dumplings and green banana and yam just seemed to keep coming out of the pot. It never used to empty. And I just used to think about this notion of, today we talk about sustainable practices, and our families lived that life, but we didn't call it sustainability. And I was reading, I don't know how many of you have read Austin Clarke's Pigtails and Breadfruit. If you've never read it, pick it up and read it. It is such a brilliant read. He was a Barbadian author, but he talks about his relationship with his mum and his aunts. And he talks about the way that community and commonality and this process of making and remaking. But what got me, he was also talking about things like cricket. But he talked about what we called this notion of the flour bag, and how I think in Jamaica we would call it the crocus bag, and you had different grades of the crocus bag or the flour bag. So he talks about the white cotton flour bags, the really fine quality ones, because you didn't throw nothing away, he said. And the white flour bags were used to make the best things to wear, like your Sunday wear, or the cloth that would go on your bed, or the curtains at your windows. And this was the cloth that you got your flour in because it wouldn't get all the weebles in it. And it had this connection with the cotton, the pure Sea Island cotton that you could get from St. Vincent. But it also made me realize how our parents and how our elders were so understanding of material, this notion of how they made things work and how they understood how to make things last, but also why the front rooms, etc., were the way they were. We laugh when they say, "I'm keeping the plastic on the chair because I want to make it last." We laugh, but when I read things like Pigtails and Breadfruit, I understand where they're coming from. This notion of they didn't have much to start with, and so when they get it, they make it last. We may laugh now, but this notion of sustainability, of sustaining practices, or this notion of you work and you make things out of little that you have, and the fact that flour bags were this base cloth, and the women used to know how to bleach out the blue, and that cloth would be used for the boys to make their cricket whites. But the fact that you could be singled out as being poor if for one little sense the bits of blue you couldn't get out. And he says blame would rest at the door in the washtub of the poor cricketer's mother, because boy, you're wearing a flour bag, you're poor. The flour bag shirt, your flour bag shirt to Sunday school, you're poor. But it made me realize how resourceful our Windrush generation were before they came here, and how resourceful they had to be when they were here. And this resourcefulness was also passed on to the next generation, but somehow it kind of misses And by reading some of these stories, we find out what that resourcefulness is. And it's this understanding of where you belong and how you belong. And by understanding that resourcefulness, we start to recognize that when we talk about today's modernity and sustaining practices, that when we go back to our countries for holidays, or we look at those countries, we can look at them in new eyes of this modernity of sustaining practices and this sense of belonging, because our families have been doing this for generations. This notion of sustaining practice is nothing new to us, because we know how to make things out of nothing. We know, we use every bit of a coconut. We use every bit of we were cooking outdoors in coal pots. We were making ceramics out of nothing. We use ceramics for everything. We know how to make water cold. We didn't just rock up today and just not know how to do stuff. But it's about how we use our knowledge and how we impact that, how we imply that knowledge, and understand that our knowledge does have power. And it's how we write about that knowledge and share that knowledge, and stop thinking, oh, well, it doesn't mean nothing. It doesn't have any power. We need to write it down and we need to share it. And I keep going back to dressmaking. I can't help but go back to textiles again. And find that if it's through textiles, through ceramics, through music, whatever we want to call that aesthetic identity and that aesthetic self, that it allows you an assertion of yourself, and it allows, by that, an extension, a collective identity, which allows you a sense of belonging. But I think at the moment we need to collect those oral stories. We need to not stop collecting those oral stories. And Windrush, if it allows us to have these funding moments where we can collect those stories through oral history, where we can collect those stories through people writing things down, where we can do workshops where people share that making, those stories, where they start having things collected in local libraries, where people can come back and hear them, then we can start to sustain a kinship and an identity which is constructed and inspired, and then is given a sense of place. And this is what Professor Carol Tulloch talks about in her work. So I think one of the things that is really important as we move forward is to think about how we construct our own self-identity through the work, that whatever work that we do. So if you knew that your granny used to sew, find out how her mother taught her how to sew. If you knew that your grandfather was a tailor or a shoemaker, who taught him to be a shoemaker? If you knew somebody in your family was a ceramicist or a musician, how did they learn to be the musician? Because that's how you find out that story before. What was he before? That sense of that time sense comes to the fore. But how do we share stories from miles away? And this is me sharing my stories from miles away. So the story on the far left is me and my twin sister when we were about 9 or 10. And the story on the far left is my aunt and my grandma. So the picture is not in our front room, it's at a photographer's studio. So, you know, when you get dressed, you have to come home from school, get dressed up in your fine Sunday best, you get shunted down to the photographic studio, because you know that picture's got to go off to Granny in Jamaica or wherever. And then Granny in Jamaica is sending you back a picture, and this will go by airmail to share the story. And then Auntie, second picture from the left here, is sending you the picture of her and her little sister that's got to come back. And then this is my mum with her friend who is sending the picture back home to grandma to say, this is how I'm doing. So these pictures keep going back and forth. And then the last picture is my little sister whose picture's been sent to grandma to say, this is the little one who's now little, who's going back. So we didn't have Instagram and Facebook and all them back in the day. So this was the way in which every year, every summer term, the pictures would go backwards and forwards. This is how we're doing. This is what we're doing. But it wouldn't be in our front rooms at the time. It would be the photographer's studio. This is how we're shaping up. This is how we're growing up. And then the airmail letters would come. But in sharing these stories, we're sharing our belonging. We're showing how we're coming up, how we're moving on. We're sharing our notions of we can't yet travel back to see you yet because we can't yet afford it. But this is how we're coming up. But what my mum was also showing, my grandmother, was how she's using her sewing skills, how she's dressing up the kids, and how she's dressing up herself. And then here she is again showing, but this picture at the top is the one. So after my mum came in 1960, she left the hotel that she'd got the first job in, and then got a job in one of the first West Indian shops in Handsworth. And she was able then to network with all the women that came in on a Thursday to order their food. So she got to know a lot of the women, because what they would do, they would come in on a Wednesday and a Thursday and order their food and pay for it on the Friday and Saturday when they got paid. So she would get in the Milo, the saltfish, the ACKHI, the yam, the bananas, because that's all come from the wholesalers. And so it was really interesting seeing my mum and then getting a big magnifying glass, blowing up this picture, being able to see Milo in 1962 in a shop. And that is very rare. So when we see these pictures and you see a Black woman in a shop selling, that's a very rare picture to actually see that in England in 1962, because that didn't happen. And to then see the Milo and everything in the shop and the selling. And there's mum again, dressed in a stylish dress, and that's me in the background in my Sunday best. That never happened. That was my birthday. That's why I'm in my Sunday best in the park. But that wouldn't normally happen because we don't play in the park on your Sunday best. That you'd be in trouble for that. But that was my birthday, so that was allowed. But the thing that photographs allow us to do is step back in history and step back in time and tell these unique stories of belonging and how we belong. And the thing that I get from these as well is at the same time I've got a whole plethora of background information. I've got adverts that my mum used to keep for the various sewing machines that she would buy. I've got adverts from the various dressmakers dummies. So I've now got mum's full dressmakers dummies that she bought from 1960 to 1970. All the various ones that I've used for my research to talk about how Black women make. So she's got a small little size 6 one all the way to a size 24 to accommodate all the women that used to come into the house to be measured up for their clothing. So that tells me the various sizes that she was making for between 1960 and 1972. All the women that she would be making for, all the different sizes. But mum also made shirts for men. So she had a man's dummy as well. Because she was actually taught to make tailored shirts for men, but she wasn't allowed to make trousers because it was improper for a woman to make trousers for men, because she wasn't allowed to measure men's trousers. So this notion of belonging for a lot of women on this conservatism, the textile stories that I'm allowed to gather tell me how we were situated in terms of creativity and making and aesthetics and sense of self and creativity and propriety and crafting and making. And I know I'm going to run out of time soon, so I've got to get a shifty on. But if we don't have these pictures and we don't have these images and we don't have these stories, we can't get a sense of belonging. And that's why Windrush Day is so important, because it gives us that sense of belonging now. It plants us in history. It plants us on a national calendar. It plants us in the school curriculum. It plants us in sociological context. It plants us in the history books. It plants us in a revision space. It plants us to actually write those stories. And I would say that making and designing anything at home makes us reveal our identities. So whether it's men doing, whether it's people growing stuff in their gardens. I remember my dad growing callaloo in the garden, and we having callaloo when I was 5 years old, or growing sweet corn in the garden. So how many of you remember your parents growing food in the garden when a garden wasn't for growing flowers, it was for growing food? Might have flowers at the front, but our back garden was definitely for growing food. And it was a way of making self, way of making belonging. And then whatever you had excess callaloo, it was sold off or given away or exchanged, because it was about community and communal belonging. And just to show you how we travel with that communal belonging, in the Jamaican Gleaner in 1962, this image from the YWCA, here it's members of a sewing class, not only finding time for themselves, but finding time for fellowship with each other. So it tells us that we recognize that, sorry, we recognize there was a time for fellowship and having leisure activities. And perhaps that changed when we moved here to England, because we lost those groups and we had to find new groups. But also, we did learn our crafts. So this was the Daily Gleaners Farmers Weekly, and told us how we had the handcrafts taught across the islands. But also, I don't know how many of you are from Jamaica, but did you know about the 4-H clubs and how they were used to teach the rise of rural skills? The image on the left is actually from the Methodist Church in Kingston, Pembroke Methodist Church in Kingston. And this was given to me by a lady called Miss Marks, who sadly passed away earlier in the late last year. And what the ladies in that church do, they grow the grass up in the hills in Kingston. They dry it out, they bring it, they weave it, and they bring it down to the church, and they make these amazing baskets and they sell them. So the money raised goes to support kids to go to school. And what that kind of teaches me is how we bring that, how many of the women bring that back here. They brought that with them when they came here. And we saw that when we see the rise of the Black-led church in the 1950s, and how through when we were ejected from many of the church spaces, and this is what women told me, they went to churches and were told, don't come back. Men went to church, told them, don't come back. They started, the growth of the Black-led church was because they were rejected from many of the church spaces. They then started their own networks and groups to support the communities, very much like they had back home. And this group still functions today, that they're still raising money so kids can go to school. And this, I call this notion of quiet activism, that this still went on in the UK in the 50s, 60s and 70s, this quiet, low-level activism, communal work that recognized a sense of belonging to support the community. And you can, when you see close up the creativity, yes, I know you can go around all the markets and see amazing baskets, but these baskets, they even dye their own raffia. This isn't the stuff that you get in the marketplace. This is all handmade, all hand done, and it's not the shiny raffia that looks like plastic. This is all done locally and made locally, and you can only buy it from the church. You can't go down to the market and get it. But it's just amazing. They've been doing this for over 40 years and they're still doing it now. So this is about how we sustain our sense of belonging and sustain our practices to move on. And I think if we can still do that sense of belonging within our own spaces and showcase that creativity, that is what we look at when we say our sense of belonging. I'm just going to quickly finish off with talking about Dorcas. So if anybody doesn't know who Dorcas is in the space at the moment, Dorcas is taken from the Bible, Acts chapter 9. And she was I'm going to paraphrase here. She was a woman who took in the destitute and taught them to be makers of cloth. They loved her. She was just one of those women that everybody adored. She fell ill and she died. Peter the disciple was brought to her, raised her up from the dead. She became a disciple. If we move on 2,000 years to the end of the 1700s, we get this new philanthropic movement going that talks about who can women model themselves after, and how can they use the skills of the feminine, which is sewing, to model themselves after, to help other women. And Dorcas is the name that comes up. What we then have in England is the rise of the Dorcas movement, or Dorcas Society. When we get travel or migration to the Caribbean, we get the establishment of Dorcas societies in the Caribbean. And here, and doing my newspaper research, here are some of the Dorcas societies and what they were doing from the 1850s, 1830s, 1850s onwards in and around the Caribbean. They were distributing clothes, they were doing annual sales, they were discussing the virtues of being a Dorcas member, they were making coats and garments for the poor and the destitute. So we have a history of Dorcas societies in the Caribbean. They were doing the same in African countries, they were doing the same. So there's this movement within the Caribbean. By the beginning of the 1920s, great evangelical Pentecostal swell. We then get this new revivalism, and Dorcas clubs begin to be formed, which have no hierarchy. When women migrate, they bring that back with them to the UK. That's a paraphrase. That's my PhD in a nutshell. But we also see how she becomes this woman of note, how they're seen as a Christian charitable society. And from that, we start to see these connections between England and the Caribbean. So we see it through the Scottish connections with Trinidad. We see Dorcas societies and schools supported. We see connections with sewing schools in Trinidad, for instance. So a Dorcas Society sewing school in Trinidad, a collection of £4,000 was created to actually support the Dorcas sewing school. In Antigua, the Wesleyan mission was supporting the Antiguan Dorcas Society. So there's always been these connections between Dorcas societies in England and Dorcas societies in the Caribbean. And then this is just me talking about those connections in the craftivism program in February this year. One of the churches that I studied as part of my PhD was a Church of God of Prophecy, and this was them in 1984 marching through Brighton. And these are the women, the Dorcas women, part of the WMV movement, and they marched down streets in Brighton singing, and they were raising some serious money for mission, and they were making Dorcas sewing stuff, making stuff, baking stuff, and they saw textiles as gifting back. So their textile skills, they said maybe they couldn't preach, maybe they couldn't sing, but they could make. So their creativity was their way of gifting back to community. And one thing that Bell Hooks talks about in her book is this notion of gifting back, that it would be remiss of Black people to not be in church and not gift back what's been gifted to them. So can we talk about our creativity as being a gift, and do we gift it? How do we gift it back? And is gifting it back sharing it? And you can, and I'll just show it a little bit more here. And so I talk about our gifts by showing people how we make our stuff. So I don't know how many of you had these smocked cushions in your front rooms. And I found out from my mom. I said to mom, how did you, I used to have to make the smock when I was little. So when I was about 10, I was making the smock bit. I couldn't make the whole cushion, but I had to sit and sew the smock bit. And I said to mom, how did you learn how to make this? She goes, I bought a cushion, undid it, and worked out the pattern. So she never bought a sewing pattern. Mom never bought a sewing pattern in her life. She did everything freehand. And then I did some research, and I found the patent for it. I found where it originated from. So one of the things I've gone back and traced the history of it. But one of the things I did at my workshops was sit down and talk to people while I was doing the smocking, and found out these whole other stories of how this comes to be and how we make in our spaces. And then at the V&A Digital Design Weekend, what we did, we wanted to challenge the notion. The Windrush Scandal had just broke, so we wanted to challenge people's perceptions of migration and what it would be like to have your landing card shredded and then rewoven to tell a new story. So we took the landing cards, as you see there. We got people to go through a journey of like walking through an airport. We got them to put in their destination, put in their arrival. We then took them through a destination curtain, and they would arrive in the front room. But as they arrived in the front room, their arrivals card was shredded. They were then given a new envelope, and then they were asked to talk about that journey. And then we got them to reweave their journey. And this all came out of thinking about what Dorcas was as a maker of cloth and giving people new lives. And I started to think about the new lives that everybody that had come from Windrush had, this new life, and how you had to reweave your lives. And I think one of the things I wanted you to go away from here today is thinking about how many elders had to reweave their lives and what happens when you reweave your life and have to write a new life. And we did this again at the Broccoli Fair, and had people just pin their stories. So reweave your life and pin your story. But I think it's really interesting when two generations meet. And if you get a chance to watch this 1992 film, Signs of the Times, Big Ben and the Jesus picture, I think it will make you laugh and it will make you cry. Because here are two daughters wanting to redo their mum's front room, and they want to get rid of the stuff that they don't think their mum should have in their front room. The mum came to England in 1960s, and there are the daughters wanting to redo the front room of the mum, and she doesn't want the front room being redone. They think she needs to updo it. It'd be interesting to know what you think when you watch it. And I'm going to finish off with an icon for me of design, Althea McNeish. In 1963, she was in Vogue, and they were talking about how she was a wind of change. She's from Trinidad. She came in 1951, so she was an early pioneer. She came on a scholarship. She was designing for the likes of Heels and Liberties by then. She just won a travel scholarship. But can you be amazed to know that there was a Black woman in Vogue that wasn't a model, and they were talking about her? And we're still having that conversation today that there are not enough Black people in Vogue. Here was a Black woman in Vogue and not a model, but she was being talked about for her design prowess. Here she was in 1966 at the Daily Mail exhibition. She designed a room at the Ideal Home exhibition for the Girl About Town. So here we are talking about how we are living in spaces and where we belong. This is her design studio. This actually isn't the room, but this is her design studio. And look how she just looks cool. And she was trying to put a place of belonging. And for her, she said, I come from the Caribbean. I love the sun and brilliant colours, but I don't want to work anywhere now except England. This is my home now. She said that in 1966. I met her in 2017. And this is the picture that I took. She died sadly last year. But she said, I'm a citizen of the world and I'm multicultural. My ancestry is Carib. I take my inspiration from nature and from man's art and artifacts. She was an amazing woman and an amazing pioneer. If you get the chance to ever read the article about her, this was from the article in the Daily Mail in 1966. And this is one of her most famous designs called Golden Harvest. And you can see on the V&A website. So when we say that we're not seen, it's a way to actually see how we belong. So I always say to people, she was designing, lots of people would have had her fabric in their homes without knowing that she was a Black woman. So she was designing for spaces when we weren't even allowed in spaces. It's a real enigma. And I want to end off by, how do we tell, retell, and rewrite our stories to give us a sense of belonging? How do we reweave, rewrite, retell? And what does your front room look like now? And I will end where I started, that I am passionately connected to Black women, Black men, all of our sense of aesthetics, that our commitment to our ongoing work, that's what inspires and sustains me. And I want us to reclaim our histories, state their particulars, gather, remember, and share our inheritance. And this is the picture that started my research journey. My grandmother gave it to me in 1990. She started it in 1989 when she heard I was getting married. And she brought it all the way from Jamaica. And I dedicated it to her. So thank you. I finished.
Wow, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rose. An incredible journey. A history lesson, a very evocative journey. There were so many moments that were so deeply resonant. For me, most definitely, and you know, as we've seen in the chat, for many in the room, in the Zoom room. We have a few minutes before we close.
Sorry, I took
Yes, it was such an invigorating lecture. Thank you so much. But before we move to the next section and maybe take one or two questions very quickly before our vote of thanks, one thing that is very important for us as people who have been historically displaced, willingly or unwillingly, and I take it right back before the days of slavery, Windrush, etc., it's important for us to recall our ancestors. Thank you, Sister Rose, for doing this in such an evocative way through the textiles. You spoke about belonging and representation, our stories, our creativity, our self-expression, and wove a story for us to go home and think about. I would just like everyone to, for 1 minute, 60 seconds, just close our eyes. If you're inspired, place your hand on your heart and remember those trailblazers, the pioneers that came on the Windrush. What stories would they be sharing? Can we hear their voices? What stories would they want us to be retelling, reweaving, co-creating? Thank you. Thank you. We are literally 1 minute to. I do have a vote of thanks to give. Can I ask our technical team, Beth and Andy, if we're able to go over by about 5 minutes? Is that possible?
Sure. Yeah, no, whatever's good for you.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, because I'd like to give honor to at least the two questions we have. And I'd love to invite everyone, as you close your eyes, just to, because we're saving this chat as a record. You know, Rose spoke about the importance of documenting our stories. So when we placed our hands on our hearts in that one moment, what came to us? What voices did we hear? So whilst the questions are being answered, and in these 5 minutes that we will ask you to indulge us in, please also share your thoughts, whatever came up for you in the chat. So for Q&A, there's a Q&A box at the bottom, and for the chat and any comments, you can please participate in the chat. So let's go to the questions. We have one. I struggled, I think this is more of a comment. I struggled with not feeling like I belonged anywhere as a teenager when I left school. I decided to own wherever I went. I paid my taxes. Any reflections on that comment, Rose?
I think one of the things that you've got to do is understand who you are. And I think one of the things that I've learned as an academic, I am one of the few Black faces in my department. So as soon as I walk, you know when I'm absent, for instance, and you know when I'm not there. And I think one of the things I've learned to do now is I take ownership of who I am. I take ownership of what I am. I take ownership of when I walk into a space, and I take ownership of me. I think one of the things that my work has given me a voice, because I've realised that I've realised myself before and after my research. There's a before me and there's an after me. And I think the after me realizes that I have a voice, and the voice is through my practice. I'm most alive when I'm doing my practice, and I let my practice speaks for me, and I've allowed it to speak for me, and it's now. And I think that sense of self comes from finding the thing that makes you happy.
Thank you so much. Thank you. The passion, as you so firmly and assertively began with. Thank you. We have another comment question. The crochet work looks incredibly complex. Are there still groups of women who make this type of crochet work? And is it continuing to evolve, as in the example you showed from the 1970s?
I think if you go back to the Caribbean, or if you go back to many of the countries inside of West Africa, you will still see this crochet work. You will still see the fine pearl crochet happening. And recently I think there was an outfit that Rihanna was wearing online that everybody was showcasing on Instagram. And that's been done by women that are still doing this really fine pearl crochet work. I think over here, there are the women that would still do that fine crochet work, because their eyesight's going, you don't see it. There are still some women that probably in their mid-50s, 60s that are still doing it, but the older women not so much, because you have to use a really fine crochet hook, and it's really, really, your eyesight has to be really good to do it. I think for the more chunky stuff, and I usually do the chunky stuff when I do workshops because it's easier to manipulate. I can still do the fine crochet work because my eyesight is still just about good enough to do it. But it takes a long time. And I know that I was approached by somebody else that's doing a PhD about this work, and they were looking for, they were searching for people that could do this work over here, and they couldn't find them. So I think you'd have to go back to the Caribbean, where that stuff is still carried on very much as a tradition, because people still have it in their homes. We tend to not have it in our homes because it's not fashionable.
Right, right. Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll close the Q&A there because we are out of time. If anybody wants to know more about Rose Sinclair's work, on Twitter, you can go to @DorcasStories. And you can also go onto the Oxford Windrush group on Facebook to find out more. I'd just like to close with a vote of thanks and some acknowledgements to the Museum of Oxford, Oxford University Pitt Rivers Museum and the GLAM team, Fusion Arts, Brookes University, that's Oxford Brookes University, the African and African Caribbean Cultural Heritage Initiative, also known as ACKHI, African Families in the UK, also known as AFI UK, and apologies from Sister Junie James, who's given me this list. She's asked for any apologies if anybody has been missed. Funders, Oxford City Council, Oxford University Community Fund, and special thanks to those stalwarts who have given their time to make the 2021 Windrush Day activities what they are and what they have been. These are but part of the wider African heritage communities of Oxford's bid to ensure that our presence is seen, heard, recognized, and acknowledged. Thank you all. On that note, we will thank you once again, Rose, for joining us. Thank you for such an inspiring lecture. Lots for us to think about and go home and really remember. Thank you for evoking that deep sense of belonging within us. Thank you all for joining. Until next year, and in between, there's much more coming. So do join the Facebook page and stay up to date. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you all.
Good night.